Hello, HTC. Welcome to our daily Devos. I'm Pastor Kurt, and today we're in Philippians chapter 4, verses 10 through 13. In Shakespeare's play, Richard III, Richard speaks these now familiar words. Now is the winter of our discontent. It seems fair that whether or not we actually plan for discontent, there is almost a certainty that we will enter a season of life where it pops up, where it becomes a struggle for us. And that isn't necessarily a winter, a spring, a summer, or a fall, but rather it's that time when the circumstances of life that we start facing begin to overwhelm us in our minds and our hearts. Paul faced that same challenge of discontent. And notice the words as we read these together today. He says, I rejoice greatly in the Lord that at last you renewed your concern for me. He's writing to the Philippian church here, and he says, indeed, you were concerned, but you had no opportunity to show it. I am not saying this because I am in need, for I have learned to be content, whatever the circumstances. I know what it is like to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I can do all things, or I can do all this through Him who gives me strength. I love that passage, and it's familiar maybe to some of you, but Paul here is in a very tough spot. He's in a Roman prison, and these prisons in Rome would have treated their prisoners very harshly. It was a difficult place to do life, because as they awaited their punishment, the goal of the prison was to tear down their dignity and to destroy any hope that they'd have. If that wasn't enough, even the food rations and the clothing that they would need would oftentimes be lacking. In fact, in that culture, it was the responsibility of friends and family to provide for those things, the food and the clothing for the prisoners. So if Paul didn't have that support, he would be lacking both in that food and in the prisoners' clothing to keep him warm and protected. He needed someone on the outside of the prison to care for him. And so he's talking now, realizing that these people actually came alongside and gave him gifts. Paul was in need of many things, but the Philippian church acted to bless him and to provide many of those things that were going to sustain his life. And those things meant a lot to Paul. When you read what he said there, it's really clear that those things mattered to him. But there's something even more important to Paul, and that was the essence of what he was learning, is that he was learning contentment, how to be content in Christ. It's probably important to stop and just recognize contentment isn't something that's intuitive within us. We have to learn it through experience. And that's what Paul did. And that's why in this text here, it pops up two different times, this idea that I had to learn how to be content. And the same is true for you and I. Now, the hard challenge is how do I learn to be content? When I'm given that opportunity in life and the circumstances are challenging, how do I actually choose contentment rather than discontentment? How do I make that choice in the midst of the challenges that I face? And Paul in this word tells us how he did it, and it's true of how we can do it as well. How do we avoid frustration and disappointment when things go wrong? How do we avoid envy when someone has something that we would want? His statement is simply this: we find our contentment in Jesus Christ. Christ gave himself to Paul and gave his strength to Paul to grow from these things. And as Paul followed him, he learned to be content in Christ. And it's the same thing that we're called to be. Followers of Jesus Christ, content in him. Martin Luther, who was a Christian pastor many hundreds of years ago, said this. He said, I have held many things in my hands and have lost them all. But whatever I have placed in God's hands, that I still possess. That is the heart of contentment. Anything that we have, we give to God, and knowing that if they disappear, if we seem to have less, God still has everything that really matters. All the things that matter in life we have in Christ, and it can lead to great contentment, great understanding that God is with us wherever we go. That last verse, I can do all this through Him who gives me strength, is a verse that's sometimes used on athlete shoes and whatever it might be. Maybe you kind of use that as your life verse. Recognize the context here. I can do all things through Christ, through Him who gives me strength, is linked to that idea of contentment. You and I can be content because Christ can give us the strength to be satisfied in Him. Hope you have a great week.